Hello, my name is Joseph Carlson, and this is episode 176 of Gaming with Grief, and I'm calling this episode The Sentry and Mental Health. But I want to remind you guys that this podcast will hit my website, www.gamingwithgrief.com, Monday morning at 7 a.m. So please go there, leave a comment, let me know what you think of the show. Or you can write to me at gwgpodfellows@gmail.com. Again, give me the likes. Let me know what you think of the show. If there's a game or something you want me to review, or a book or a movie, drop it there. Or just your general thoughts. Again, let me know what you think of the show. You can also subscribe to the podcast in either Apple iTunes, the Google Play Store, or Spotify. And the audio of the podcast does go up on YouTube day and date with the audio version on my website. You can also, I'm also on Twitter at JustLittleJoe. So find me in those places. So usually I don't do, I do books, movies. I've said that all in my intro before. I'm actually doing a comic this time. It's a Marvel comic called The Sentry. I was kind of reading about it because it had to do with mental health. I also read an article by Psychology Today about psychosis, so that was very interesting. But basically, if you don't know, the Sentry is a hero in the Marvel Universe. It is basically their equivalent of Superman. So he's got the power of a million exploding suns. He can fly. He has super strength. But one thing I think is interesting, and things I talk about on this podcast all the time, he has mental health issues. Like I said before, I read an article in Psychology Today talking about psychosis. And this is basically, from what I can read around the edges from the Marvel database and many fan things, this is basically what Bob Reynolds or Robert Reynolds suffers from, is psychosis. I just want to read this quick thing to describe psychosis. Again, this comes from Psychology Today. It was reviewed by the staff of Psychology Today. Psychosis is defined as psychosis occurs when an individual loses touch with reality, a break that can be terrifying to experience or to observe in a loved one. Psychosis can include hallucinations, delusions, disorganized speech, and abnormal movements. Hallucinations, perceiving something that doesn't exist, and delusions of false beliefs are hallmarks of psychosis. Disorganized speech may manifest as incoherent babbling, and abnormal movements can include motionlessness and a state of catatonia. Psychosis is a symptom, not a classifiable disorder in and of itself. Persistent symptoms of a psychosis may lead to a diagnosis of a schizophrenia spectrum disorder, such as schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, or schizoinformed disorder. Psychosis can also be a symptom of bipolar disorder, but psychosis can arise from other sources, such as sleep deprivation, alcohol, or drugs. It is important to seek professional help as soon as psychosis is experienced or suspected. So this basically, I'm trying to, to be honest, I haven't finished Guardians of the Galaxy yet, but I've also trying to read more. And this comic kind of came into my purview, The Sentry, this character, because he was in another comic I read called World War Hulk. Very good. There was Planet Hulk and World War Hulk. I might actually pick those up because I've read them before and I borrowed them from somebody. But they were really well written and drawn, and the stories were great. But the Sentry kind of popped up as this figure towards the end who was very powerful and could go toe-to-toe with the Hulk. And I kept reading. I was like, wow, I've never heard of the Sentry. I passively read comics for years. But when I read about the Sentry, what I thought was interesting was they do address some mental health issues with the Sentry. Bob Reynolds, and I think this is interesting, he got his powers to be known as a Sentry from drinking basically a super soldier serum. It seems like after Captain America was popular in the movies and in comics, everyone tried to replicate a serum. This was no different. Someone tried to replicate a serum. They created this compound that gave Bob Reynolds, the power of 1 million exploding suns, flight, super strength, and basically vision, whatever. What I think is interesting is he suffered from mental health. And I guess I read 2 issues. One of them I read was called hang on. It was just called The Sentry, and I let a friend borrow it, but I'm reading the info off of Comixology. It was published in 2000 2001. Excuse me. Ugh. It was written by Paul Jenkins. It was illustrated by Jay Lee and Phil Winslade, as well as Richard Leonardi and Mark Telegexi. I hope I'm saying that. I probably butchered your name. Sorry, Mark. But what I think is interesting about the Sentry is, in recent years, many heroes in general are. It's possible for them to have flaws, and I think one of the biggest flaws that new heroes have is mental health. Now I know maybe you just want to read a good comic story, but I think in this case, the more I read, not only did I read the Sentry #1, I let a friend borrow it, and it was very interesting. Basically, the Sentry is this all-powerful being. He is, fighting the good fight, but he realizes he's very dangerous and he has mental health problems, which basically creates another, being or whatever in his brain that he calls the Void. Now, the Void is something, it's basically like all his ill thoughts, basically his thoughts of schizophrenia are kind of like mashed up in himself. Basically, it's about mental health. What I do like about this issue, the Sentry, I got for like $12 at a used bookstore, was that it does really address this kind of doubtfulness, this kind of this clawing feeling. Bob Reynolds has this feeling all the time that things just aren't right. And there's a very comic booky kind of, roundabout way that he is kind of diagnosed with mental health. And then the Fantastic Four, Reed Richards being his oldest friend, kind of helps him deal with these mental health issues. Totally fine. Really enjoyed the issue. But what I didn't like is it kind of ended with the realization that he was the Void. Not bad. But I wanted it. I guess it worked perfectly. It was a cliffhanger, so I read it and was like, "Oh my gosh, where does this go from here?" He realized he's got a mental health problem. That the Void, not only does he have all this power, but that the Void will destroy everything he cares about because of his mental illness, has psychosis. He hallucinates and sees things that aren't there. I wanted to see where it goes, so I got another book on Comixology called The Sentry, Man of Two Worlds, Book 1. But here's the deal. When I was reading and researching this comic, because I was like, wow, this is fascinating. Talk of mental health. Where do they go with this? I was recommended this other book called The Sentry, The Man of Two Worlds. It was $8 on Comixology. I thought, here we go. Because the screen grabs and the descriptions of what was going to happen to Bob were like, hey, just to let you know, Bob goes and gets a therapist and deals with his mental health issues. And I thought, wow, that's powerful for a comic to do. Let me research that and try to bring it into the show. I always talk about mental health in the show, but I read Sentry, Man of Two Worlds, and it basically does something which I think is good, but it didn't get to the therapy part, which I've always ragged on and on and on and on and on about therapy. One thing I do think is interesting about Sentry, A Man of Two Worlds, I'm kind of spoiling both of these things, but what I think is important about Sentry, Man of Two Worlds is Bob kind of realizes that the Void is part of him, which, I haven't dealt with mental health problems, but I have dealt with grief. And I always say, and I think this may apply to mental health. If you suffer from mental health, maybe you could write in and tell me if I'm wrong or not. But the one thing I always quote is Nora McInerney from Terrible Thanks for Asking. And she says, in her famous TED Talk, she says, you don't move on from grief, you move on with grief. And what I've read about mental illness, and I did another episode on... I can't think of the name, Hellblade, Sinuous Sacrifice, when they interviewed people with schizophrenia and things like that, they talked about a healing process. And I think I'm not going to overgeneralize with people with mental health, but I know for me, it is not moving on from grief. It's moving on with grief. So I think what is amazing about Sentry Manitou Worlds is that Bob realizes that the void, this evil part of him that wants to do him harm and the people around him harm, that it is just a part of his brain. And in the Sentry Manitou Worlds, through comic booky things, basically both Bob Reynolds and the Sentry merge into one creature. Now, it's very comic booky. He fights. I've said that a lot. That phrase a lot. He has fought with many of the people in the Marvel Pantheon, like Iron Man, Hulk, Miss Marvel, Captain America. But as my friend and I were talking earlier today, you really need to come to this epiphany moment before you can start making changes, before you can start telling yourself, I really need to change my ways. Yeah, I realize I have a problem. So basically, I think in the Sentry Manitou Worlds, again, this is book's 1 of 1. I don't know where this other thing is where he got help. I do want to read that. Maybe I'll report back later on that. But, realizing anybody has a problem or that you have a problem is the first step in getting help. When my wife and I decided to go to therapy, we were in a very low place. She suffered miscarriages. Our son died. My parents had died. And she said, should we go to, do you want to go to therapy? And I said, I think I need to. It was kind of in that moment when I realized that I needed to kind of like reach outside of myself and get help for what I needed. And I think, the Sentry Manitou Worlds, I think, was a great way to say, yes, I need help. Now, I'll probably report later. I want to read the issue where he goes and gets therapy. I think that'll be important. I want to see what the therapist says in that issue. I don't know if the writer has been to therapy or they're researching things or, it's just a total fictional retelling of what has happened. But I do just want to say that I think it is important that the Sentry is addressing issues of mental health, addressing issues of kind of acceptance of their mental health state. Yes. You know what? I don't know why I'm running from you so much, Void. You are part of me. We need to deal with this together. I think all that is great. And I think in comics that needs to happen. Well, just in art more and more. Again, my friend and I were talking today. We hadn't seen each other for a while. It was a great conversation. But we talked a lot about mental health, that it is important for people to come together and talk about mental health and just be open to like, hey, I'm not having a good time. I need help. Please, at least listen to me. Yeah, a little bit shorter episode this week, but again, I think the Sentry and the Manitou Worlds #1 are important if you're dealing with mental health and want to read like a comic book version of that. It really hit me that, hey, they're really using this as kind of an allegory or a way to talk about these issues. So with that, it's a shorter episode, but I want to remind you guys that this podcast will hit my website, www.gamewithgrief.com. Please go there and let me know what you think of the show. You can write to me. Let me know if you think the show is good or bad. Give me suggestions for games to review. You can also just let me know what you think of the episode. You can also write to me at gwgpodfellows@gmail.com. Go there. Let me know what you think of the show. Again, write to me. If there's a game you want me to review, I'll do that. And you can also subscribe to the podcast in either Apple iTunes, the Google Play Store, Spotify, and the audio of the podcast will go up on Monday morning, the same time it goes up on the website. You can also find me on Twitter at JustLittleJoe. And I think with that, everybody, that will be the end of this episode. I hope everybody has a good week. Read The Sentry and the Manitou Worlds from Marvel. They're about $8 each on Comixology if you want to, get the other issues. You can probably find them at half-price books for pretty cheap. Anyway, everybody have a good week, and I will talk to you again next week. Bye.